Welcome to the Chapter 35, Section 2 lecture, and in this section we're going to look at the global depression. So we're going to see the world between World War I and II and the period known as the Great Depression and the events that led up to it, as well as the impacts it had. Now, after the war, by the 1920s, by the early 20s, we begin to see a recovery taking place throughout much of the world. So World War I left Europe and the global economy shattered. But by the time countries began to produce again and began to trade again, you actually had a period of prosperity. They call it the Roaring Twenties. And so these images, right, show people going out. Look at how busy the city is with people going out, having a good time. Cruise ships, right, like the Hamburg American line, right? The United States and Germany are now friends and promoting cruises going overseas. So it was a period of prosperity, but economic problems were on the horizon. One of those economic problems is in Germany with the losing of the value of the German Deutschmark, the German mark. Germany had to pay for reparations following the war. It had to pay for all of the cost of the war, which would today be in billions of dollars. And so in order to pay that debt, Germany just printed money. And you can see from these images here how worthless that money is. You could see those kids that are playing with stacks of cash, or the woman who finds it cheaper to burn paper money, burn cash, to heat her stove instead of buying fuel or buying firewood. There you see a street sweeper sweeping cash that's flown off into the street. Imagine seeing a bunch of cash on the floor and not picking it up because it was so worthless. That chart there shows the rapid inflation that goes on, or in Germany, it is the value of one mark in paper marks, one gold mark in paper marks. So think about this like as the peso. For those of you that are familiar with the Mexican peso, how we have $1, how it could be worth 12 pesos, 18 pesos, and you could see in 1918 it was a 1-to-1. And by 1922 it had gone up to 100. So imagine the peso going from $1 being worth 18 pesos to 100 pesos. It would be disastrous. Now in Germany, between 22 and 23, it went from 100 all the way to a trillion. In other words, it was worthless. People would have to run to the store to buy what they needed on their lunch break, because if they waited till after lunch, prices would have been 10 times higher and their money wouldn't have gone as far. So this leads to a lot of problems, economic problems in Germany, but it begins to ripple to the global economy, and this is going to shape Germany's loss of faith in the Weimar Republic. It's going to open the doors for Adolf Hitler to take advantage of this sense of desperation. But there's weaknesses in the global economy, not just Germany. The tangled financial relationships that were established by countries that are tied together, right, begin to see these problems. Germany is paying $2 billion in reparation payments to the Allies. The Allies are paying war debts to the United States. The United States is loaning billions of dollars to Germany, right? So they're connected, and when Germany's money is losing value, this has a global impact as well. U.S. lenders begin to start withdrawing money in 1928 from Europe. And then industrial innovations are also beginning to reduce the demand for raw materials. Technology is getting better. We're being able to save on some materials, so there's not as much demand for certain materials. And then there's post-war agriculture that depresses in Europe, the US, Canada, Argentina, and Australia. Countries that used to supply Europe with food during the war no longer need to supply as much food for the war. Their economies are going to suffer because once Europeans return to work and go back to farming and working, they're not depending so much on the countries that were not at war. But what really leads to the depression is the stock market crash of 1929. So there had been periods of peaks, booms, and recessions throughout the 20s. And in 1929, there's an economic boom that leads to speculation. And speculation means you think things are going to be worth more than they are. And when that happens, there's a frenzy to buy, and people keep buying and buying, kind of like what happened a little bit with the GameStop stocks. People buy and buy because they don't want to miss out on an opportunity, but pretty soon you're paying way too much for things that aren't worth it. And so October 24th, 1929, on Black Thursday, lenders begin to call in loans. And investors are forced to keep selling. So people begin to lose money and the stock market crashes because as lenders call in loans, if people don't have the money to pay it, or if the banks don't have money that people want to withdraw from the bank because people aren't paying their loans, then people begin to lose faith in the system. They begin to want to sell off stock. Because they have to sell the stock, they have to keep selling it at whatever people are going to pay, which means they're going to pay less money. People are going to lose investments. And it causes the Wall Street stock market to crash. And so billions are lost in this event, and it's going to take years to recover. There's economic contraction after this. There was overproduction because the speculation there's overproduction. People are making more than what's actually selling, but now that everyone's losing money, there's no demand. So there's a lot of products that are not being sold. So there's widespread business failure. And then it's just a ripple effect. If businesses close down, they fire their workers. If their workers don't have jobs, they don't have money to spend. And if they're not spending money, other businesses are being impacted. Businesses that used to depend on consumers. So those businesses shut their door. And those businesses lay off people, and now there's even more unemployment. And by 1932, the United States' industrial production and national income had dropped by half. Massive unemployment, 25% unemployment. You could see from these images people lighting up to get free food, free coffee, people out looking for a job, not being able to find it, people waiting in bank to try to pull out their money from the banks and banks not having enough money. So people losing their entire life savings. You could see the price of common stocks and how the crash of 29, right? How big of a hit it took, went back down to 1921 level. So all the gains that had been made in 10 years were lost. And banks began to fail. You could see after 1929 how rapid the failure of banks begins to go. Right? 4,000 banks in 1933 shut their doors. That means that any money that people had in there, it gets lost. They don't. There's no way for them to recover it. There's nothing to protect their investment at this time. Since then, we've passed some rules to prevent this from happening again. And again, you could see the unemployment from 1929 to 1933 when it peaks. Unemployment went to about 25%. And then by 1937, we see it down to 16%. It begins to climb up again. So all of this is leading up to World War II. World War II and the wartime economy is going to help the United States out of that depression and bring that unemployment down because we begin to produce weapons for the war. So industrial economies like Germany, Japan, they're unable to sell manufactured goods for fuel and for food. In 1932, you begin to see 35% unemployment and 50% decreases in industrial production in Germany. So 1933 is when Hitler is going to come to power, but he's already rising to power, and he's taken advantage of these economic uncertainties to do that, as you read in Section 3. So European industrial states and Japan are unable to sell the United States because there's also tariffs in place. So we begin to see more communist movements and socialist movements, gaining popularity, fear of communism spreading because of the economic desperation in European countries. In primary producing economies, in economies in Africa and Latin America that provide like one product for export, you also begin to see them taking a big impact. Sugar, coffee, bean, tin, nitrates that were exported see a decline in price, right? If you are an economy, like a primary economy, what that means is that you only make one thing. And if my country is producing beef, and I'm doing well, my country's producing beef because I'm selling beef to the world, but all of a sudden no one's buying it and the price drops, then all of my source of income drops because I only make one thing to export. I'm not diversified. So Latin American states are going to begin to enact tariffs. A tariff is a tax you charge on a good that comes in from another country. Brazil begins to build up its steel and iron. In colonial Africa, it hurts the export economy, but local economies are not impacted because the local economies, like the towns that people live in, what they're buying and selling has nothing to do with what they're producing for the Europeans because they're not industrialized. So those economies are not as heavily hit. In the Philippines, the sugar industry is protected by the United States. Some places you see protective tariffs. So this is going to create economic problems all over the world, not just in the United States. And countries are going to try to protect themselves. One of those ways is through what's called economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is when you see high tariffs and import quotas, setting limits on what countries could sell in yours, taxing goods that come from other countries, and then prohibiting certain products from other countries to promote your own country's economy and economic self-sufficiency. So when the US begins to put in place trade restrictions, it leads to retaliation. Other countries begin to do the same thing, and international trade drops by 66% between 1929 and 1932. Right? And so you can see this product, right? Buy American-made goods, made in America, protect your job. So this is something that we've heard recently in the last few years when Donald Trump got elected, and we saw Donald Trump put in place tariffs on certain agricultural products, on steel that comes in from Canada, and then you saw soy farmers began to hurt in the United States because China began to place its own retaliatory tariffs. So this is something that kind of still plays out today. And we saw this happen during the Depression, and what it did was it made the Depression last longer. It prolonged it because of these protective tariffs that every country was placing on their goods. So now we're talking about years that people are facing despair, and they're looking for the government to begin to solve their problems. So they begin to look at policies to reduce female employment, especially if married, right? Giving job preferences to men who had returned from the war and having the women no longer working. You see millions of people struggling for food, for clothing, for shelter. Marriage and birth rates are going to decline, and suicide increases because of this despair. People are choosing not to have large families because they cannot afford to feed everybody. Right? And this picture here is a very famous picture from the Depression, showing the despair of a mother who's trying to, get her children through this time of poverty. So through this personal suffering, it intensified social divisions and class hatred. You begin to see places, tent cities pop up, right? A lot of homeless encampments in cities. John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, criticized the policy of planned scarcity, right? When the government was trying to make things scarce to keep price stable, and it would destroy food, while all these people throughout the country were going hungry. But destroying food to keep the prices stable to help the businesses that are selling the food instead of using that grain to feed people that didn't have food. And then this picture here, right, shows the world's highest standard of living. It's a billboard, right, that's advertising. This is from before the Depression, right? There's no way like the American way. And of course, it's an Anglo family, and you see this line of African Americans that can't find work. So racism also began to rear its head again, right? Not that it ever disappeared, but you begin to see racial discrimination in the 1930s. There's an organization called the Black Shirts that recruits about 40,000 people to its racist agenda that says no African American would be given a job before a white person, right? So that white people are going to get to work first, And they were promoting, kicking black people from their job to give the jobs to white people. In 1931, Labor Secretary William Doak blamed unemployment on Mexican workers, and the United States began the repatriation program. Over 500,000 Mexicans were deported to Mexico. They were rounded up by immigration, and hundreds of thousands of those were American citizens. They were because they were born in the United States, but they went because their parents got kicked out. Having been raised in the United States, some of them didn't speak any Spanish, having to live in Mexico. In 2017, there was a paper that studied the economic effects of that mass repatriation, and it concluded that cities with larger repatriation intensity perform similarly or worse in terms of native employment and wages relevant to cities which were similar in most labor market characteristics, but which experienced small repatriation intensity. Our estimates suggest that the repatriation may have further increased native levels of unemployment and depressed their wages. So there was a study that looked at the impacts of this in 2017, and they found that states or cities where immigrants were repatriated, were kicked out, they did the same or worse. In other words, it wasn't the Mexican labor that was creating it. And in some places, deporting people made things worse because you're also, again, you're losing people paying rent, buying things from the store, etc. Okay, so here, this is where a lot of people, when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, and this idea of "Make America Great," or they also began to use the term "America First." And so for a lot of people, especially historians, are like, "Whoa, wait a minute! This is a period when last time we saw America First was when the KKK was out in the open and promoting, right? Here you see one God, one country, one flag, but it didn't include people of color." And this picture at the bottom shows people at a train station being put onto trains to get deported back to Mexico. So in light of the Depression, you begin to look at other ways the government could try to put people back to work. And so we see economic experimentation take place, and the classical theory of capitalism that government should mind its own business, laissez-faire, don't get involved, don't do anything, capitalism will self-correct, begins to be replaced by what's called Keynesian economics, the theories of John Maynard Keynes, who argues that the Depression was a problem of inadequate demand, not supply, that the Depression was there because people don't have money, and that the government should play an active role in stimulating the economy, right? Maynard believed that the government should put people to work. And if the government puts people to work, then those people will have money to jumpstart the economy. So in 1932, President Franklin Roosevelt passes the New Deal. They protect the banking system with laws, and they establish insurance for banks. They spent money on massive public works. This is when they begin to build a lot of the country's highway system, replacing old sewage and piping systems, the electrical grid. You see farm subsidies. Farmers are giving money so they can grow food. Legislation is establishing a minimum wage. Social Security, right? When you have Social Security, older people can retire and still have some money, freeing up jobs for younger workers, right? Workers' unions were getting protection. And then during World War II, you see a lot of increase in military spending, which ultimately ended the Depression. Here in San Diego, we could see during this era, they had the Works Progress Administration was created. So they hired artists. This mural here, this is a mural in Balboa Park in one of the, it's where the puppet theater is, near that, in that building. There's a mural that was painted during this period. The fountain in the little Alcazar garden. The old Globe Theater, the Shakespeare Theater, what used to be the Hall of Champions, now going to be the Comic-Con Museum. These are all buildings that were built by the Works Progress Administration with money from the Great Depression. And throughout San Diego, the Del Mar Racetrack, the county administration building that's located downtown, the old post office in downtown, the old, San Diego State used to have a stadium, okay, Aztec Bowl, and San Diego State University, the main campus. A lot of this was funded with money from the Works Progress Administration. So after the New Deal, you begin to see with the first New Deal, the unemployment rate begins to drop. 1937 goes up again, and then Germany invades Poland. Once the war hits, you begin to see it drop even more so. And by the end of World War II, you had seen the U.S. out of the Depression. So the last thing is just looking at this primary source, right, of Franklin Roosevelt's Nothing to Fear. So you could just pause it to interpret. I won't take up more of your time by interpreting because I know you have other homework and other lectures to listen to. But be able to see if you can read this and make connections to what we just discussed or what I just discussed. And in the last lecture, I'll be going over the challenges to the liberal order that we begin to see taking place in Italy, in the Soviet Union, and in Germany. Until next time.